Joining me now is Izabella Taborovsky, Senior Advisor for the Kennan Institute with the Wilson Center, joining us from Jerusalem. Izabella, thank you so much for being here. Let's begin. Navalny was the main opposition rival to Russian President Putin, but Navalny was in jail. So was that not enough for Putin? Was he afraid of Navalny, possibly, even though he was in jail?
Well, I think Navalny represented something that really was important. It was a mirror that was important for to hold up to the regime. He certainly was no longer a threat, a real threat as a politician. The upcoming election would have gone on no matter what. With Putin's victory, it's not even really possible to call them elections. All of Navalny's people, everybody who was against Putin's regime, are now really abroad. There is truly no real threat to Putin. And yet I think Navalny did represent that idea, the ongoing kind of notion that Alexei tried to convey, that this is a party of thieves and crooks, they're corrupt, they're undermining their own country, and that remained a threat.
You mentioned the timing of this death. This is 1 month before the elections, but it seems that you don't believe that this could have had any impact on the elections. Is there anything to say about the timing of this untimely and sudden death?
You know, I'm not really sure. And the truth is, we don't know what really happened, whether any specific actions were taken to murder Navalny yesterday. It is, of course, completely fair to say that he was murdered by the regime, and this is the only way in which Navalny's people in Navalny's circles, and really, again, everybody who is against Putin's regime are referring to. They refuse to say that he died in prison the way Western media are communicating it. He was undoubtedly murdered. The murder began with the poisoning several years ago, from which he never really fully recovered, and then he returned to Russia, and then he was held in really inhumane conditions. We know that his health was getting progressively worse. I would not necessarily make anything out of the timing of it. However, I would say that if there were steps that were taken, in fact, I would say that in order to kill him at this specific time, I would say it's simply to project Putin's power and to show perhaps that he is now at the top. He is running the agenda that he wanted to run 2 years after he invaded Ukraine. Even though the West is expressing indignation, it's hard to see what can be done, and that Putin really has absolute power over his opponents.
Well, I'm curious, because as such an outspoken critic against Putin, will Navalny's death change anything for other people who oppose Putin and Putin's policy in Russia?
Look, in practical terms, probably not. Again, all of Navalny's and all of the entire system, all of the institutions that stood against the regime collapsed forcibly under the force of repressions that had been going for many years, but of course, it really crushed everything after Putin reinvaded Ukraine 2 years ago. And I think that it's a very difficult moment for the opposition, for Navalny's closest circle. And yet you see them say over and over again that as soon as they start to feel despair, they reproach themselves, because they know that Alexei himself would have told them, you don't have a right to despair. If they killed me, then it means that they're afraid of me, and you have to continue. So I have no doubt that once everybody gets through the shock and the trauma and the grief, people will continue. But what it will look like, it's hard to know.
Well, and when you mentioned just the ongoing war in Ukraine, specifically for countries like Ukraine, the view of Navalny, it's a little bit complicated. On the one hand, Navalny, he was a fighter against corruption and for the rule of law, but he's also seen as a nationalist. So how does this contradict itself?
Well, it's very much in line, I think, in Ukraine, understandably, in many ways. Ukrainians very often doubt the sincerity of the Russian opposition, of Russian liberal opposition. They feel that it's impotent, and they also don't believe that it actually fully stands with Ukraine. I'm pretty close to those circles, and I would say that it's an unfair accusation. I think that the Russian opposition very much, and I know it, and Russian independent journalists journalists, I'm not talking about political opposition, but I'm talking about independent journalists, people, activists. Ukraine is always on their mind, and they wish for Ukraine's victory. There's no question about that. Navalny's accusations of him being nationalist trail him since many, many, many years ago, when he was just starting in politics, when he in fact did take a kind of hardline nationalist line, but he has really changed in recent years. It really truly hasn't been a part of his campaigns, a part of his platform. It almost seems, and he apologized for it and explained it, and his people explained it all over and over again. What he meant when he said what he said. I think that to kind of use those old remarks of his against him is really not fair.
Well, that's a great point you bring up, really enlightening us onto all of these latest developments happening here with his sudden death. Izabella Taborovsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.